I wonder, what are you blind to? I think, like most men, I am blind to a certain amount of household dust. And to the blind man, the visionary is always mad. Now, whether the visionary is speaking about spiritual realities or speaking about some future state in the world that we haven't attained or achieved yet, I think that's true. To the blind, the visionary will always seem mad. But spiritually, the question is, what can't be seen? So we have this passage that I read from Exodus, which gives us some sort of sense of what is going on here. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. We are distracted by the things of the natural world. That's what blinds us and often causes us to forget the principles that we should aspire to or try to live by. And it's not always that the natural necessarily contradicts the spiritual principles, but if we're solely focused on natural things, there's so much that we miss because we don't have that higher perspective on life. And this is why Jesus says what he does to the scribes and Pharisees when he calls them blind guides. They have this fixation on the natural things of their religion, the natural practices, which lead them to forget the higher principles and wider, broader principles that they might keep in sight if they had the spiritual principles in mind. It's also why in the Old Testament we have this curious law which says that if a person is blind, he could not serve as a priest. It seems a trivial thing, doesn't it, to exclude a person from service in the priesthood simply because he is blind. I think I wouldn't qualify because I require glasses. What purpose is served by excluding someone who is physically blind from the priesthood? They may be indeed a very wise person, a very perceptive person. Well, it represents something, and it represents this idea of spiritual blindness being a limiting factor. So I just want to think about how this plays out for individuals. You know, we have this passage from Micah chapter 6, and you know it because I say it, so read this one so often myself. We get so bound up in carrying out certain natural tasks and rituals that we forget the bigger picture that it's supposed to represent. We forget that there's a much broader category of activity that needs to apply to us, things that extend to attitudes, our beliefs, and simple decency in the way that we treat one another. One of the things I've noticed in recent weeks is the idea of karma, and the way the idea of karma just seems to lead people down a certain track of activity. So I'm thinking about people who I know who ascribe to the idea of karma and the idea of the needing to do good. And it seems to me, and I could be wrong, it seems to me that it leads them to kind of need to prove their goodness on almost a daily level. They need to be showing to the world that they are earning their good karma. And it's not that they're doing bad things, they're doing good things. But they've kind of lost sight of the purpose of it. Or they haven't been able to see beyond the kind of point scoring that goes on sometimes. It becomes more about measuring them as a person rather than the good that they are doing. And then during the week, I came across this video. It popped up on my feed. This is the International Near-Death Studies YouTube channel. And they keep serving me various things. And I saw this one, I think, on Friday. This lady called Michelle, and the title was, "I Had a Hellish Experience and Found God." And what she talks about is our need often not to see things. Our need to deny a reality that presents itself to us as blindingly obvious sometimes. She talks about the way, in her case, this led her down a path of dependence on painkillers and alcohol to try and avoid this thing in front of her that is presenting itself daily. The only way she felt she could forget it and felt like she could move on with her life was through the use of painkillers and alcohol. And I think it also leads to anxiety and it leads to depression. When we have this ever-present reality which is showing itself to us, and yet we seek to push it down, we try to hide it from ourselves, we seek to make ourselves blind to it. I wonder whether when you were a child, you ever had a monster under the bed? Did you ever have that experience, a monster under the bed as a child? I did. I remember it quite clearly. And the thing I remember about the experience was I didn't want to look. Because I knew in my heart there was a monster under the bed, and if I looked and I could see him there, he would be terribly, terribly frightening. And I didn't want to look. But do you know what? There was no monster under the bed. And had I looked, what would have I discovered? I would have discovered there was no monster under the bed. And don't we spend our adult life doing exactly the same thing? Again, going back to Michelle, she talks about the need to be right, the need to win an argument as a way of finding self-validation because I don't really believe that I deserve that validation. This is one of the ways she sees this manifesting, and she talks about it in her own life. And so through this experience that she records in this video, she says this, she says, "I closed my eyes to an old reality and opened my eyes to a new reality that I did not even know existed." And I think we could all well do that. Open our eyes. See the reality that is in front of us, because often it is not as scary as we imagine it to be. And even if it is scary, the only way to move through it is to look at it, to see it for what it is, to understand it, and then from that point to know how to move forward, how to move beyond it. Because there's one other thing that Jesus said, and we have to ask ourselves, do we believe it? He said, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." How much do we really believe that statement? Because if we don't, we will spend our time, we will spend our lives seeking to be blind, closing our eyes to the reality because we believe that's a better way, an easier way of living. But I challenge you, reach out for those words. understand what the Lord is saying here. It is a great, great promise.